Are we at risk of seeing another big recession? As China's economy has investors running for the hills, we ask if the world is on the verge of another big crash. Also on today's program, the threat of superbugs. As they become more resistant to antibiotics, are they posing more of a threat than ever before? And in Picture This, we take a look at the vast steel structure Ukraine's building over the Chernobyl disaster zone. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. China is an economic powerhouse which has grown at an almost unprecedented rate in the last 25 years. But is the dragon now facing economic disaster? Stock prices have plunged, the yuan has dropped, exports are falling, debt is rising, and China's economy expanded at its slowest rate in a quarter of a century in 2015. Last week, the government even stepped in and closed market trading just 30 minutes after the opening bell when trading was volatile. It's all hit investor confidence as the world still struggles to recover from the Great Recession. Today's newsmaker is China's economy, as we ask whether the dragon's running out of steam and what it could mean for the rest of the world. The Newsmakers Sara Hemrajani has this report.
As goes January, so goes the year. If that saying's to be believed, moves in financial markets at the start of the year indicate where they'll be in 12 months' time. And with global stock markets currently taking a battering, traders may have to brace for a grim 2016. A key source of that turmoil, the world's second biggest economy, China. Asian and European stocks have tumbled this week as worries about China's weaknesses and the Communist Party's response fuel a sell-off.
The concern is that both what they had done on the currency front and also looking at the market volatility itself were indicators that things were not going particularly well in terms of economic growth. And that spooked the markets all around the world. And whatever happens now, the underlying reality is that we are looking at China growing a lot more slowly. There are some people who fear a hard landing. And if that is the case, then obviously the reverberations all across the world are going to be very significant.
The turbulence in China has brought to surface a deeper fear about Beijing's grip on the economy. The Asian powerhouse is cooling, and this transition could be messy. The latest batch of data shows China is facing problems on multiple fronts: industrial overcapacity, declining exports, falling property investment, rising debt levels, and a depreciating currency. Top officials have been experimenting with a range of measures, but at times they seem to be on the back foot. And with decisions being made behind closed doors, the lack of transparency is rattling many investors who've long suspected target figures are inflated.
If the market is looking at a 6.5% GDP growth rate as an official target, the sort of number we're expecting for this year, I suspect that the real number is much closer to 4%. So really the absolute number isn't as important as the trajectory, and the trajectory at the moment is down, down, down.
China's authorities have acknowledged the country's slowing pace of growth. They're aiming to push through new reforms and regulations, including lower business taxes and ways to boost consumer demand. It seems Beijing's entering a new era of economic management, but with investors' confidence waning, it can't afford another slip-up. Sara Hemrajani, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss China's economy is Gordon Chang. He's the author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China. And we're also joined by Anne Lee. She's an expert of US-China relations and wrote the book, What the US Can Learn from China. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Anne Lee, let's start with you. The Royal Bank of Scotland, in their 2016 forecast, said it's going to be a cataclysmic year because of China. And they said, sell everything. Did they have too much to drink on New Year's Eve, or were they onto something?
I think that they might be exaggerating the effect of China on the markets. I think the markets actually were using China as an excuse for an overdue correction because many folks wanted to have a high year end and once they were able to collect their bonuses at year end, then they could sell off those expensive equities. And using China as an excuse was the perfect way to exit a lot of those positions. The fact is that China has been slowing for several years now. Everyone already knows that China has been transitioning. The fact that China's stock market fell really is inconsequential to the rest of the world because very few other outside investors are in China's stock markets. So the falling stock markets there are not affecting pension funds anywhere else, really.
Okay.
And the fact that China's currency is falling is, so minor, frankly, because they were trying to respond to the IMF's demand to have a currency that was more market-oriented. And the spot market was saying that, China's currency needs to be lower. And so the central bank basically was saying, okay, we're going to try to be more market-oriented.
Okay.
And the fact that they devalued it by a few percentage points, that's minor compared to the devaluation that's been happening with Japan, which went down like 60%.
Okay.
The euro went down 20%. So.
Okay, good point. Gordon Chang, Ann Lee says China's transitioning. You say China's collapsing. Why?
Well, you look at the Chinese trajectory on growth. We don't know what the real growth rate is. I think that there's substantial evidence showing that it's 1 or 2%. But even if it's higher, the important thing is that Chinese leaders have lost the playbook. We have seen since November 2014 that there have been 6 reductions in the benchmark interest rate. Since February 2015, 5 reductions in reserve requirement ratio, no appreciable effect. There's fiscal spending is increasing dramatically, and clearly that was evident at the end of last year, and yet again, no effect on the economy. So whatever the growth rate is, it is slipping into contraction, and the only thing Chinese leaders can do is really slow the pace of descent. Substantial economic structural reform would help, but within the context of the Chinese political system as it now exists, that's not possible. So essentially what they're talking about right now is an economy where you have deflation and you have substantial debt and they don't know what to do. And I think you see this with the money coming out of the country. $461 billion of net capital outflow in the third quarter, $367 billion in fourth quarter. This is a problem because no country can stand outflows of that sort, not even a country the size of China.
Okay, let's get Ann Lee's response to that. Ann Lee?
Well, I would say the outflows are actually encouraged by the Chinese government at one point because they were tired of holding so many reserves when in fact they can become a reserve currency, which just happened. So they don't need to have these reserves, and the outflow, frankly, means that the central bank doesn't have to manage them. It was clearly a headache. And they were actually using the reserves before to prop up the currency, and if it's allowed to free float, then there's no really a need to do that. Frankly, China's economic slowdown is just following a very familiar economic pattern that all the developed countries have gone through. So the US used to have much higher growth rates, up until after World War II, and now, it's slowed down. Before, even back in the 70s, a 3% growth rate was ghastly. But, today, if we ever hit 3%, that's amazing. And it's the same with Europe, and Japan and the 4 dragons, like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. All these countries had superbly high growth rates for a time, and then they've slowed down tremendously.
Okay.
China's simply following the same trajectory.
And I want to ask
you... So
you...
it's not collapsing because none of these other countries collapsed.
Okay, a lot of people's existential financial fears revolve around the idea that the global economy is too heavily connected to whichever way China goes. Do you agree with that?
You're asking me?
Yes, Anne.
Okay. Well, the whole world is heavily connected, not just to China, but everybody. Of course, China is sort of the linchpin because they are the largest trading nation in the world. And so what happens to China certainly will have ripple effects everywhere. But this can be seen as good or bad. It just depends on whether the country's prepared to take on these opportunities of these changes. Changes are going to happen no matter what. And so with China, China has had a tremendous growth rate in its industrial revolution. So commodity exporting countries were able to take advantage of that. Now that China's transitioning into a service economy and a consumer market economy, well, the countries that are able to deliver finished goods to China are going to experience a boom.
Gordon, Anne believes that China's economy is the linchpin here. You think, Gordon, that the Chinese economy is in deep trouble. So does that mean that we're all going to go down with it?
Well, the problem is that essentially the global economy right now is much weaker than people thought it would be. And we see the IMF dropping its global growth forecasts. And also you've got geopolitical tension right now, especially the Middle East, but also in Ukraine and, of course, around China's periphery, South China Sea. So even if you have unimportant news coming out of China, which we saw last week with, for instance, the manufacturing survey that was disappointing, even that can cause a ripple effect, as Anne talked about. And so you see, for instance, Asian markets tanked, European ones, and of course, big drops in the Dow Jones. So clearly, what you've got is a situation that is now on edge. Now, China, I think, is probably less important to the global economy than most people think, but it doesn't really matter what exists. It really matters people's perceptions. And as long as people see, for instance, China being at the center of the global economy, and as long as they worry about other things, this is going to be a problem that could easily reverberate across China's borders and affect the whole world.
Okay, I want to ask Anne, with that in mind, the fact that whether it's true or not, if people's perceptions revolve around the fact that China is the most important economy, it affects confidence. Would better transparency from the Chinese government with their economic policies mean better confidence in China and mean more stable markets? Do they need to be more transparent?
China actually has been very transparent. They've been announcing reform policies every day. And there are many think tanks that track how many reform policies they've announced and how they've been performing. This is frankly unprecedented. They've done more about being transparent about their policies than just about every other nation on the planet. So to say that it's not transparent is actually not an accurate description of what's happening. One just needs to go there and read the newspapers and they will see what's going on.
Okay, Gordon Chang, final question for you. If the leadership, the Communist Party leadership, read your book, The Coming Collapse of China, got worried and called you in the room and said, hey, we'd like some advice. How do you advise us to move forward for the next couple of years? What would you tell them to do?
Well, I think they've already passed the point of no return, so I don't think there's very much, if anything, that they can do. You know, obviously they do need to be transparent. They announce things, of course, but then they do things in private. And as we saw last week, everyone was concerned about the untransparency of the central bank's actions on its currency. But I think really, of course, what they need is structural economic reform. Maybe the rest of the world will give them the time that they need, but they can't do that within the context of the top-down political system that doesn't allow the changes that, yes, they've talked about these changes for years, but they never implement them. And I think that's really because of the top-down political system, a state-directed economy. That's just not compatible with where they have to go. And unfortunately, Xi Jinping, the ruler of China, has been taking China backwards on balance in terms of economic reform.
Okay, we are running out of time, but I saw Anne Lee shaking her head there. I want to give you 15 seconds, Anne, to respond because we are running out of time. I'll let this be the last word. Go for it, Anne.
I mean, to say that they've never reformed anything is just not actually facing the facts. I mean, they've
I didn't say that,
made
Anne.
the interest rates more.
I said on balance, they've been going backwards.
Yes, you did. You said never. What do you mean by
I said
backwards?
on balance,
Frankly, it
Xi
seems
Jinping
like they're
has been
making a
taking the
lot
country backwards.
on balance. Well, I would disagree.
On balance,
Okay.
they've been
so
shutting out foreign companies from China. They've been recreating state monopolies. There's more state direction in the currency markets and in the stock markets.
Okay,
this is not a good story.
Okay, you
and
both
that's
clearly
why the world
disagree.
is worried.
Unfortunately, I've got to wrap up this segment, but it's been thoroughly informative. Always good to have very smart people on the show. Gordon Chang and Anne Lee, thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, as superbugs grow more resistant to drugs, could antibiotics soon prove ineffective? And in Picture This, we take a look at the vast steel arch Ukraine's building in the Chernobyl disaster zone. Scientists say superbugs are becoming more resistant to antibiotics, and there's fears they're evolving too fast for science to keep up with. Experts say people are overusing antibiotics, and that's helping bacteria to evolve resistance. The Newsmakers Sara Hemrajani looks at the threat posed by the superbugs and the science community's struggle to fight against them.
The world is becoming a much smaller place. With more people crossing continents, the rise of global health crises is a growing concern. But beyond the spread of viruses like HIV and Ebola, there's a bigger fear. Scientists say the rise of superbugs is changing the face of medicine.
Superbugs are true and they are evolving, and one day we will be dealing with them.
And some antibiotics, the ultimate weapon against bacteria, are no longer working.
The drugs that we used to use to treat those infections, we cannot use them anymore. The bacteria gets strong, we are not getting stronger.
Antibiotics were long thought of as the miracle cure. The arrival of penicillin in the 1940s revolutionized medicine in a post-war world. But scientists didn't foresee that organisms would fight back. Bacteria multiply rapidly, causing infections. When treated with antibiotics, resistant bugs survive and multiply again. The misuse or overuse of antibiotics can make those bacteria resistant to other drugs available, creating a superbug. The fight against bacteria is getting tougher. In sub-Saharan Africa, parasites carrying malaria are developing resistance and spreading to Southeast Asia. In December, the UK reported 16 cases of antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea, a sexually transmitted disease. And just a few months ago, a new discovery startled the scientific community. Bacteria known as E. coli has developed resistance to colistin, a last resort antibiotic, in a highly mobile section of its DNA. That means it can travel, and it has. Samples were found in China, Denmark, and Canada.
All antimicrobials which are effective against these organisms are being lost one by one. And the antimicrobial pipeline is dry, meaning we are not expecting new antimicrobials in the near future. And therefore, we have to be very careful with the ones we have available at the moment.
If superbugs aren't contained, the risks are serious. Procedures considered miracles of modern medicine, like organ transplants, would become too dangerous to perform, and dentists could even think twice about removing a tooth. Scientists agree the only way to stop superbugs is to avoid overusing the only weapons we have against them. Turkey is one of the biggest global consumers of antibiotics. As of last year, patients are only allowed to receive antibiotics through prescription, and doctors are at the forefront of changing old habits.
We are going into post-antibiotic era, or in other words, pre-antibiotic era. Why? Because of the untreatable quality of those infections that are in the community right now. We are going to watch and see how the patient copes up with these infections, like in the old days.
Researchers are also trying to cut down the time it takes to find out what a patient has.
Scientists in this lab are testing hundreds of samples every day for various diseases and infections. But the idea is that in the future, diagnosis will not take days, but hours.
The scientific community says more research is needed to find out what superbugs are out there. But many experts believe politicians haven't yet fully grasped the severity of the threat posed by them, and say that is the biggest problem of all. Sara Hemrajani, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now via Skype to discuss the superbug risk is Dr. Eileen Marty. She's a director at the Travel Medicine Program and Clinic at Florida University. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Marty. In Sandra's report, she points to the fact that many say politicians don't fully grasp the severity of the problem. Do you agree with that?
Unfortunately, that's true. There is still not a universal understanding of how serious this threat is. to health, to the world, to individuals by our leading politicians. There are many who do understand, but many who don't.
How bad can it get in light of antibiotic-resistant super gonorrhea and other horrifically frightening-sounding prospects? Are we in big trouble?
If we don't change our way of practicing and come up with innovative new ways of diagnosing and treating these bacteria in the very near future, yes, we will be back to the situation that we had before antibiotics.
I can walk, sorry to interrupt you. I can walk just down the road here, go to a pharmacy without a prescription, buy any antibiotics, and worse, if I'm like many people, I might have the flu and think that I need antibiotics. You know, people self-diagnose, they Google diagnose. Is this happening worldwide?
Yes, it is happening worldwide. Some nations have taken more specific actions to counter it than others. And the European CDC, for example, has done a number of surveillances within the European Union to try and determine which countries are and are not trying to follow appropriate protocols and put together appropriate action plans. The same with the World Health Organization. And the World Health Assembly has been active in this for quite some time now. In the United States, I belong to the President's Council on Combating Antimicrobial Resistance. This is a very strong initiative by the United States to try and combat this problem at multiple levels. We have 5 main objectives, 5 main routes through which we're trying to combat the issue.
Tell me about those 5 main objectives.
Well, one of them involves some of the things that you were talking about, which is appropriate use. So you don't take the antibiotics when someone has a viral infection, but you focus on those infections that that need the antibiotic. And more specifically, a second objective has to do with the diagnostics, to try and very rapidly distinguish, preferably at the bedside, whether someone has a virus or a bacteria or a fungus or what have you, and then ideally exactly which bacterium so that we give the best antibiotic for that particular individual's infection. And only when they need it and for the length of time that they need it. So that's another goal. We want to strengthen surveillance for this. So in other words, we want to make sure that we know what's going on in each individual country in terms of the brand new antimicrobial resistances that are happening. Because the sooner you know something's happening, the sooner that you can confront it directly. And we want to accelerate basic research into the production of new and innovative approaches. Maybe, first of all, we want more vaccines available that will help educate our bodies so that our bodies can eliminate the pathogen without having to take an antibiotic, understanding that antibiotics are fantastic for eliminating a particular problem, but they also inadvertently kill off bacteria that can be very helpful to us. So we don't want to use an antibiotic if we don't need to. And so these innovative approaches is goal number 4. And goal number 5 for the United States is to work with the international community so that we do this in a comprehensive fashion with everyone being more or less on the same page as to what we're trying to accomplish.
Dr. Eileen Marty, that was thoroughly informative. Thank you very much for joining us. In today's Picture This, it's been a ghost town, frozen in time for almost 30 years. Chernobyl in Ukraine is the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster. Drone footage has revealed the progress of a giant steel arch being made to cover the damaged reactor and try to contain the radiation. Today's newsmaker was China's economy. Stocks are plunging, the yuan is struggling, debt is growing, and exports are dropping. All of these factors have seen investors run for cover from China. The government even stepped in to close trading when stocks were volatile. On today's show, we asked what the dragon's struggles could do to the world, as the global economy is still recovering from the Great Recession. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.